Welcome to the Web Platform Podcast, a developer discussion that dives deep into all things web. We discuss topics relevant to developing for the modern web and the web platform of today, tomorrow, and beyond. Welcome to the Web Platform Podcast, episode 22. We are live on Google Hangouts Air, and today we have a whole bunch of open source people. We're going to talk about open source development, how developers can get involved. And I'm going to start by saying my name is Erik Isaksen. I'm a UX engineer at 3 Pillar Global, and I'm going to be the host today with our panelists. We'll start with Christian. Hey, Christian.
Erik. So, you want me to introduce myself?
Yeah.
I'm an open source developer. I work on a bunch of Node stuff, mostly identity and access management related. And that's about it. Kind of a bum.
All right.
So.
And Joe Barnes.
Hey guys, how y'all doing? So I'm Joe Barnes. I'm a senior software architect at Mentor Graphics. Generally, we do desktop applications, but I get the pleasure of doing some web stuff. And open source wise, I'm heavily involved in the Lift web framework. I'm still the newest member of that open source community in terms of committers, but still learning my way around, and I'll try not to say anything that misrepresents the framework while I'm here.
Nice. And Matt? Mr. Krieger?
Hey folks, I'm Matt Krieger. Hello everybody. I am a developer and evangelist at Heroku. Heroku is a cloud hosting platform. And that's me.
Awesome. Thanks for coming on again, Matt. Nick?
Hey, I'm Nick Niemeyer. I work on various open source stuff, including the federated wiki. I've got a bunch of little libraries on NPM, but nothing huge. And I'm a JavaScript agent engineer at Relic.
Nice. And Rob?
This is Rob Simpson. I'm a senior web developer at AgileX Technologies. We work on the government platforms, building out web applications right now for the Veteran Affairs and the United States Postal Service, and currently just started with the Department of Defense. I'm in a transition now. Tomorrow will be my last day, and then I'll be changing over to FIS Global, working on a platform as a service.
Very nice. So thank you guys for coming on again. I wanted to get this group together. Joe Barnes actually inspired this particular episode of the Web Platform Podcast because he had an interest in talking about open source, and it's a really great topic to talk about. Can we just go through, for those who are sort of new? I don't think there's many web developers who are new to this, but just in case, if there's any out there who don't know what open source is and why we have it, can you guys talk about that?
It's free software, right? Isn't that just the end of it?
Is it always free, though?
No.
We'll start with Stallman.
So,
drivers.
yeah, it certainly depends. Anybody here working on open source software that's not free?
There's no monetary cost usually, but...
Yeah, that's right. Yes, that's right. Are we talking free as in free speech or free as in free beer, right?
Yeah.
Well, Matt, you've done a lot of open source, and Christian too, I know firsthand looking at your projects. And Matt, how did you get started with open source? Like what drew you to it?
One word, community. I mean, I think that's why a lot of us get into open source, is because finally we have this opportunity to work on projects with people that maybe we don't work with on a day-to-day basis. I don't know about your experiences, but I found that a lot of people that I enjoy working with the most are people that I work with on and off in different positions at different companies. And it's kind of selfish to say, but open source gives me an opportunity to work with those same people that I've really enjoyed working with in the past, that I have a lot to learn from on projects that are outside of the scope of my day-to-day duties.
And Christian?
think it's just a really good way to learn. There's all this code out there, and if you want to see how something works and rip it off and borrow this feature or that one, it's really easy to do. It's easy to learn from open source, and that's kind of how I got into it, is just trying to figure out how things work.
Did you have the same experience as Matt, where the community drew you in?
I think maybe a little bit, but probably not right away. I think I spent a lot of time hacking on my own, just reading books and stuff. Community became important a little bit later.
Is nobody going to say that they get free commits to their projects? Come on, guys.
I get a few, but probably like less than 5% of my projects.
Those are those
5%.
Those passive aggressive comments on the issues, like oh yeah, why don't you fix that for us?
I really can't be bothered to maintain this anymore. Can somebody else please do it?
Why is true not equal to false?
Well, it's definitely great in the fact that the community is so open and quick. Like a good example of that recently is that the Node forward separated from Node and it did IO.js, right? And so now they're upset with certain, I don't know the details, but they're upset with certain factors that, it's not moving as quick under the control of a company. But if they had total ability to control this in the open so that any community member can come there and change it, it'll move much faster and they'll be able to get the features out that they want quicker. Would you guys agree with that?
Oh, I think the node forward thing is really complicated.
Yeah.
It's kind of I don't know.
A flame war?
Yeah, it's a huge flame war. It's kind of an issue of governance. I think a lot of open source projects have had this problem in the past where as they grow so quickly, they don't have the structure to support the changes and the decisions that the community needs to make. And right now, the sort of history of Node is scattered throughout GitHub, and
Right.
It's hard to assemble reasons behind decisions and that kind of stuff. It's a little bit of a mess.
I mean, that like at one level, it's very complex, but I think it's part of what makes this conversation so appropriate right now is that there is so many good examples of both of the edges of this sword that we call open source. You've got the situation with Docker and Rocket and CoreOS happening. You've got the Node forward, and I think at the end of the day, what it comes down to is that when you open source your project, anybody can hit that fork button and do something different with it. And maybe they hijack your community, and maybe it's your community that keeps that project alive and you lose them. And I think that's what we're kind of seeing with Node is you have a lot of people that are really sensitive to this issue because what they love about Node is the community behind it and all of the momentum it has. And they kind of see like, are we diluting this by creating a fork? And I think that the answer there remains to be seen. Like, will Node forward, are Isaac's intentions with Node forward to eventually merge it back into Node Core going to play out, or are we seeing kind of like the end of Node? I don't think so, but
my hope is that it goes kind of the way that Merb did when it forked from Rails. I mean, a group of people got to pursue their own agenda. They got to figure out what was good about the direction they wanted to go. But in the end, everyone was able to reconcile it and take the best of what they'd done and throw away the stuff that didn't work out.
Yeah, I mean, the funniest things I hear people screaming about are like, this is browser wars all over again. Like we loved JavaScript's fragmentation so much on the client that we had to create it on the server as well.
Being someone who's working mostly in the browser right now, I got to admit I'm kind of enjoying watching this happen to the rest of the Node folks. But I think that's a good thing though. Really, like the browser wars are the reason we have fast JavaScript engines. Like if there wasn't some competition, then we'd still all be writing IE6, and Microsoft would have done the right thing disbanding their team.
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, there's that competitive nature, and even that's true in any war, right? Where you're going to have advances because of necessity.
Although you could also phrase that up, playing devil's advocate here, that it took an inordinate amount of effort for Google to go out and build a browser and to kind of push some of these innovations forward using V8. That perhaps we haven't moved far enough forward in client-side JavaScript compared to the amount of time and money and effort that's been invested.
Right. I mean, open source too has been around for a long time. It's just I think recently it's been much more prevalent, right? In the past, maybe 5-6 years. But you can go back to like even Linux, right? Like maybe even further. I don't know. So there's how many forks of Linux are out there?
Yeah, I mean, you've got so many distros kicking around, and I think that definitely contributes to the overall appeal of Linux. But I mean, I think part of what also is very appealing about Linux is that at the end of the day, you can always pop a terminal up and have an experience that is predictable and consistent against all these distros. And that's the magic that's difficult to create in open source. It's fine to have a community, but you can't have people need to learn something new regardless of which product they pick up. And I mean, we'll see that I think with Node. What are they calling the new one? It's io.js, right? It's not Node board anymore. I don't expect that they're going to break compatibility with the old API. That would be crazy.
Right.
That'd be a way to lose a community. As soon as you start doing that, your software doesn't run and you go back and use Node instead.
So when you guys started with any open source, I haven't done a lot of it, but a lot of my commits that I've put out there are pretty basic, like maybe documentation, maybe some simple HTML or JavaScript. So do you guys have any good stories to tell about certain commits? I know Matt in particular, you had a very, very large project when you were at GoInstant, the backend as a service. Do you guys have any particular stories you'd like to tell?
I mean, I think the story I would share there is maybe the story of attachment and loss when GoInstant finally closed their doors.
Yeah.
Because for those that don't know, GoInstant was a startup around a real-time cloud-based API that you could use in the client. If you use Firebase, similar to Firebase that recently got acquired by Google. And GoInstant was acquired by Salesforce. And the technology was interesting, exciting, and was built around this idea that two people could browse the same website at the same time, and that kind of spun off into this more generic API that you could build almost anything with that was real-time, JSON data-based. And I worked on a project that was integration with GoAngular and kind of trying to bring these models and offline mode to the client. And people used it, and that was just really cool, and people contributed to it, and that was really cool, and they were interested in it and wanted to talk about it, and that was super fun. But when GoInstant kind of shut its doors and they brought this product kind of back home to Salesforce, I mean, there was definitely a feeling of loss there, and of disconnect, like, oh no, I've just invested so much time in this project, and now it's kind of come to an end. And so I think, with open source, sometimes you feel like when you're working on something that's open source that it has like a life beyond what you put into it. You know that one day you'll leave the project, but you expect, because it's open source, that the community will then run with it. And I think that's a great feeling when that happens. I think maybe you've seen that with TJ, I'm not sure how do you pronounce his last name again? Holla, the guy who created Express. He's kind of moved to the Go community, and he's left his projects behind. Does anybody know how to pronounce his last name?
Holloway Chuck.
Holloway Chuck, that's it. Yeah, and so I'm sure that he's sitting now in happy in Goland, looking back at his projects that are being actively maintained. And I just wish I could have that experience and that feeling with GoAngular.
Yeah, I can only imagine, because I remember seeing your commits. They'd be like every day you'd have like several dozen, and it was really cool to see the project grow. And I know like Strangeloop now owns a lot of the stuff that or maintains, I should say, a lot of the stuff that Mr. Holloway Chuck did, and he still maintains Koa, from what I understand, though. So that's some connection, but yes, he's probably.
But is that the same thing? When somebody moves to another community, I don't know if they can really be committed to a project that's, in another language that they're not using actively or on a daily basis anymore, especially the Node community, because our projects in the Node community just move so fast. And if you're going to move on to Go, I mean, it's kind of the community's going to move on without you. I feel like I should kick my feet up on this couch and we'll turn this into a counseling session for me. Grief counseling, the loss of my open source project.
Yeah, well, it's a lot of work, and I really feel for the people who put out these projects out there on their own, and then when they're successful, now you have to maintain all of this. And what you did was full-time job, so you're getting paid to do it, but you got to work with the community, which was great. And I'm sure you did some on your own. But a lot of these people, they volunteer the time, and then once it becomes a full-time job, in addition to your other full-time job where you get paid, then it's hard to maintain, but all these people are counting on you because they're using it. How do you guys remedy that?
I don't know if we have a remedy for that one yet.
Yeah, I guess not an easy question. Sorry.
Yeah.
I had an opportunity to interview the creator of Ruby recently, Matt Matsumoto, and that's a podcast that won't be available. It's a 3-part series that'll be available, I think, just after Christmas.
Nice.
And he said something really interesting. It was about I asked him something similar, which is, how did you end up with this core team? And he said that, he looked around at the people that were contributing to this on a daily basis and the toll that this took on their lives being part of such an active project and doing this on top of their work. And that's how he chose who he was going to bring into his core team and make it part of their full-time job. And so I think maybe the answer is, if you see a viable business in your open source project, then bring the people that are the most active contributors in and give them a paycheck so they can do it for a living.
Right, because they're already invested at that point, and you know that they really enjoy working on the project because they're taking their free time to do it. That makes total sense.
Yeah, it is awesome if you can actually do that. I know where I've been involved in open source, we've not had the opportunity to finance it that way, and so yeah, it's still up to just a group of dedicated developers who love working on it. So, like with Lyft in particular, it's a very small community, especially when you look at the number of active developers. I think there's only 3 who are actively working on the project right now, but everybody that's in the community is actively busy in a day job, quote unquote, perhaps using Lyft, but there's nobody who's able to get paid to work just on that, so we don't move as quickly as other frameworks. And yeah, like you said, there's people who are counting on us, and that's always a challenge too. But for the most part, we're just I guess leaning on the passionate developers who are behind it, who just really believe in the open source project that we have and are just love working on it and glad to help the community.
How did you get started with Lyft Web?
Yeah, so how I got started with Lyft is kind of a fun story. I spent a lot of years in Java up to this point, and I think late in 2012, I had been looking at other alternative languages on the JVM and ended up coming across Scala. And around that time, I was learning Scala. I learned about Lyft Web and how, at least at one time, it was the most prominent web application framework in that ecosystem. And I started using it and was just still to this day just really enjoyed how different it was. It really was a unique approach to web development, and really enjoyed that. And so I started, just got into the community. There's a Google group that's kind of the center of the community for Lyft Web, and tried to learn more about it and started using it for a few pet projects and some proofs of concepts where I was. And eventually it came to a point where I actually proposed that we use it at my current employer as the framework for the application we're working on now. And as far as my involvement in the community more directly as a committer, that happened after I started integrating Angular with Lyft. I started looking, I found some open source work someone else had done. A gentleman by the name of Doug Roper. He had pulled together some really cool ways to make Lyft and Angular just work together, like in harmony in a really unique way. And so I just took that, turned it to a module, and kind of so modules kind of like a plug-in for Lyft, and it just sort of took a life of its own, and the community noticed all the work I was putting in on it, and I got invited to be one of the committers, which is an interesting point. We hadn't really said this yet, but as I said, I was invited. There's Lyft Web has I guess you say a different model than what I'm typically used to seeing in open source. Is that there is a actual group of committers. There's a community around it beyond that, but the model that the original founder, David Pollock, had come up with to somewhat handle some of the discussion we had earlier about how communities grow, and they grow beyond what's capable of decision making. So he was kind of the benevolent dictator for life of Lyft for years, and he always wanted to have a small group of committers that way if you said, hey, I'm going to become a committer, you're invited, but it's a commitment, and so if you're going to write code, you're not going to do a fly-by-night, throw in a bunch of code and quit maintaining it. And so he understood that people would depend on it, like we've been talking earlier. And so you want to make sure that if you come in, great. If you have to leave, make sure you find a good way out so people can continue to maintain the project and continue its longevity. And there's also legal reasons he did that. David has a background in law, so he wanted to make sure that the letter of the open source law was actually followed strictly, and that corporations would never have any legal issues with using Lyft. So I had a little bit of a backstory there on how Lyft works, but that's how I got into it. It's mostly just my work with Angular, and I have a lot of fun with that, and it's just been fun working on something that's useful for my company, but not part of our business or I should say value proposition. We're delivering content. It doesn't matter if we're using Angular or Lyft or whatever. So being able to have the liberty to continue those developments open source has been a lot of fun.
Yeah, the community is really good. I've found, at least, about recognizing people who put in the effort and the time.
Yeah, that's right. And also even for me, I said early in the podcast, I'm really new in the community, and as I got invited somewhat recently, if you look at the Lyft core projects, I've had 0 commits so far. I've got some ideas on stuff I'm going to work on soon. I'm still kind of getting the idea of how the committers like to work and things, and trying to understand what sort of needs we have in the framework. Because what's interesting is that Scala is such a bleeding edge technology, yet Lyft Web is surprisingly mature for that world. And but yeah, the community is great. We love helping people, and that's why, like I said, I try to inspire this podcast because we just like to get the word out. Like, hey, here's, if you're looking for something, this might be it. It might not be. But we just love helping people and love developing web applications.
I think it's interesting that you kind of stumbled upon that, the fact that he was trying to make sure that it was following the letter of the law in regards to open source, because I often like to forget that open source is this mechanism we use to share things without reprisal. When clearly at the root of it, that's what it is. There's that saying, you steal like an artist. Nobody steals like a developer. We're always running around taking inspiration or just copying and pasting people's code directly into our own, and
so
it
true.
works. It's a great way to learn, and so we've kind of created this, like I said, this mechanism that allows us to do it without having to worry that some large organization is going to come and crush us.
That's a good point.
Yeah, that's right. You also wanted to make sure that people can use it, I was misunderstood on a blog post I wrote several months ago where I was just showing how you can set up a Scala project or something for open source, and just to help people, like, hey, if you got an idea, here's how I can get it out there in the Scala community. And in there I said, hey, don't worry about the license. And what I meant was that with the kit you had, it was going to have the Apache 2 license, which is kind of the de facto standard among the Scala projects. But yeah, the guy pointed it out to me. It's like, hey, you can't say that. If you don't put a license on it, nobody can use it. You own the copyright. And that's it's very important. It's no small issue at all.
Yeah, I think everybody's very respectful that I've met, but I've heard stories of the dark side of open source with people who are very I don't know what the right word would be, maybe passive aggressive, talking about, like why would you do this code this way? I wouldn't take this. And I think generally the community isn't like that, but has anyone experienced that?
I think that the community has gotten much better. There was a while that found myself being a roamer, stalker, kind of looking around, afraid to, take part, do any pull requests, things like that. And then I got involved in a couple things. First, a couple years ago on some legacy code with jQuery Mobile, we found that a date picker wasn't working for our specific application. So we did a pull request, and that was the first time. But for the most part, I think that the open source is more, not more, but for those that might be on the lower level that are wanting to know how they can start is by reading over documentation and reading actual code. I've thoroughly enjoyed Angular because the fact is when I go into the Angular code, I can practically learn all of Angular mainly for the fact that they have documented it so well. So for, those that want to think about, okay, well, I'm afraid to get in and start making changes, doing any pull requests, is that, I found that just the starting point was, read the documentation. Because when you're reading documentation, you could find simple errors and help out. And then all of a sudden, you feel a little bit better that, people aren't going to push back to you and say, okay, well, you know what, you just messed up our code or your code sucks. If you just make a couple changes to some documentation, then all of a sudden, okay, you're like, you start to get comfortable not just stalking around. And then at the same time, a lot of these open source projects start by somebody's particular need for something. So, I mean, you see a lot of libraries, frameworks, but, they all originate from, other open source projects, which are helpful because it gives people ideas. And so we've done the same thing as to where, we'll actually fork a project mainly for the fact that it's got the starting point that we need, and then we'll go ahead and add on to it. But, I think that from a community standpoint for a developer that hasn't really gotten active in open source, I think it's fairly easy just by helping out with documentation.
Yeah, for sure. And documentation is very impacting. A lot of people don't realize how important it is. And the good thing about that is, even though it's very impacting to developers, if you were to pull the latest code and your change is in there and it's just documentation, then you're not going to break somebody's application. But if you're wrong in the docs, then yes, it's bad, but it's not going to be as bad as if you broke the code. And I think generally most projects are going to not say like, well, why did you break our code? They're going to be like, hey, well, can you do another pull request for this? And just very friendly. At least I've seen when I contact people on Twitter or Google, and I talk with people about the project, they're very open-minded and not judgmental. And I've found that the case with almost every project that I've contributed to, which is not a lot of them, but and open source developers I've talked with. Have you guys had that experience?
I think it really depends on the intention of the creator. If the intention of whoever is open sourcing their source is to create a community around it, then the chances are that they're going to be very open and willing to accept pull requests, and they're going to do their best to encourage people to join the community. And that's going to come with a lot of, that means they need to be responsive to criticism and feedback, which I think you're seeing, Docker take some flack for. Rocket started up, and there were some comments made on Twitter, and it was kind of an instant reaction, and maybe that's kind of a bad example of, or a good example of doing a bad job of encouraging community around a project or an ecosystem around a project. But then you also just have projects that you make open source, and they're really still your thing, and you really don't care about anyone else's input. And like Rob said, you're still just you're making that open source, so if somebody wants to, they can use it as the starting point for their own project. But you're not really looking for anyone else's input.
Yeah, that's what forks are for. So, I mean, you don't want to do too many forks, right? Because then you have this divergence. But I mean, if you're really passionate about it, that this feature should be in here. And I had this actually on a project I just did where it's a client project, but we were using an open source plugin. It was for jQuery for, I think it was a placeholder one. And one of my teammates contacted the developer and he said basically, well, this is what the spec says for placeholder, so I'm not changing my code. And we were like, okay, that's great, because we just wanted an answer. We wanted people to respond. It wasn't that, we didn't have another solution without him. We're not totally dependent. But it was great that he got back to us to say, no, I can't do that. If he said yes, we would have been happier because then other people could benefit from it. But because it was specs oriented and he was following his vision of the project, we respected that, and that was great.
Yeah, you mentioned something in there that reminds me that the worst thing you can do as an open source maintainer is ignore a comment or especially a pull request.
Totally.
If someone's taken the time to write code that runs, it's kind of a jerk move to not at least acknowledge that and tell them why that shouldn't be part of your project.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had that experience where I got a little happy-go-lucky, saying, okay, well, you know what, I'm gonna do a pull request just so I can feel like I'm part of the community. Well, I didn't take the time to actually fork and then do a local build, make some code changes, and run the test. So I just went ahead and just did my pull request and made a change, but when they looked at the pull request, they were very nice, and this was with Angular. They came back in the issue and they just said, okay, well, this obviously is something that you did not do. If next time you do a pull request, make sure that you're able to follow these directions. And so I think that any community that you want to get involved in, it might not necessarily be up to the person that maintains it to always be fair game in how polite they are, but you just have to make sure as a contributor yourself that you get into the communities that you want to be part of.
Yeah, and I think the tech people in general, I've reached out to so many people from the podcast here, and everyone has been responsive. They've been very open, and like I've been very, very happily surprised. Like, it's amazing when people that you look up to and you're saying, wow, these people are doing amazing things out there. Like Matt, we had you on the episode. We were really excited just to meet you, and people were just like, yeah, sure, sign me up, or the people who couldn't come even responded and said, hey, thank you so much, but we're really busy. And I think it's important just to have that communication out there.
I think there's also the role that open source plays, like in a larger picture, that there's so much surface area to some of these systems that we depend on and don't even realize. You look at my wife's an accountant, and the impact for me of Heartbleed was kind of like negligible. It's like, you know what, we'll get it all fixed up at Heroku. We had it fixed within a day. That delayed, so at the time she was a tax manager, and that extended their tax season by, I think it was 3 weeks. You think about the cost that's involved there, where every firm keeps all of their tax managers in the middle of busy season for an additional 2 or 3 weeks. It's a huge cost. It's huge. And of course, now what we're seeing with Sony, have you guys seen all the madness with the Sony hack around the Interview movie?
No, oh yes, the one about the Korean leader Kim Jong.
There's been an enormous leak, and I guarantee it'll be a few weeks, and then if it wasn't something related to their own network security, they will have used some sort of open source software that will have facilitated this leak. And some developer somewhere will work on that open source project and kind of put a cork in the leak. But
yeah,
these things that we work on have ramifications far beyond what I think we're aware of in the moment when we're just submitting that patch.
Yeah, for sure. It's a great point. We had Zeno Rocha on from LifeRay on the show before, and he told us a story that I thought was pretty amazing. It was me and Christian we were hosting, and he said, because Christian said to him, correct me if I'm wrong, Christian, I think you said something like, I was looking at your GitHub, and I saw that you have like crazy amounts of commits daily to open source. How do you do all this? How do you find time? And he told us a story about when he started in open source, he was committing to some jQuery plugin or jQuery, maybe it was the main library, but he was very new to it, and I forgot the person. I think it was Rick Waldron responded to him and said, you shouldn't be doing it this way. You should be doing it this other way. And he took it really good. He's like, okay, well, maybe I'm not doing it the way I should be doing it. And he took it as very positive. So even, I don't think Rick Waldron was trying to be, nasty or anything. He was trying to show Zeno, hey, this is the way that we do this on this project, and to be consistent with our code, you're going to want to do this particular thing. And that was okay too. I thought it was an interesting story because that's one of the fears that we have, is that judgment when we start doing this. At least I had. I don't know if you guys had this as well.
Yeah. When I was new to writing software, I mean, that was one of the biggest hurdles. Was you put something out on GitHub, I mean, that commit lives forever. Everyone can see any mistake you've made in your career.
Yes, a revert will not get rid of it.
Yeah. And that's, I mean, it's hugely intimidating. You just kind of have to take it like other creative disciplines, where you can't just keep working on one thing and never release it. There's no value in that. You have to just kind of suck it up and release what you've got, and I don't know, defend it as you can and fix it as you can.
I think that's the cool thing about software in general, is that you can start out with absolute crap and trend towards something really good, and once you realize that it's okay to put crap out there because you're just working on it, and everybody else knows this, that nothing works as advertised in the beginning, and I mean, as long as you're not over-promising right away, but you can see projects in various stages of completion and kind of get a sense of what the big picture is, but not everything has to be perfect right away, and that's almost like an invitation to dive in and help out as well, even if it's just by giving feedback or whatever. And that fear, I think it really stops a lot of developers from getting started. I know there's several years went by that I didn't put anything on GitHub because I was just terrified. Everyone was going to think that my code was crap, and I'd never be able to work again and everything like that. And
yeah, I had the same experience.
But once you get past that, I mean, I think using other people's open source code and realizing that, especially once you start reading the code, is that even really, really well-regarded developers publish a lot of really crappy code, and they work on improving it over time. So it's not just you; it's everybody else too.
Yeah, my code's still crappy, but it's not just you.
When I joined Heroku, I started working on this sample project, and a few days ago we kind of picked it up again because it's going to launch around Christmas, and it's a New Year's resolution tracker. It's a sample, and they were asking me how long it would take before I had it ready, and I was like, well, there's probably only like 2, maybe 3 hours of work left, but I'm going to spend the entire weekend polishing it up because I know this is the first project I'll have written at Heroku, and everyone who works at Heroku, and let me put like in brackets, they are smart people, intimidatingly smart people, they're going to look at this, and I feel like I'm going to be judged on this, so I'm going to spend the entire weekend polishing this project up so that I'm not embarrassed when it launches next week. So I would have said, if you'd asked me this a few months ago, I would have said I've taken enough bruises at this point throughout my career that I don't care anymore. I'll push any crap out there and I'll work on it after the fact. But
Right.
Clearly that's not the case. I still have this sensitivity to judgment that you're referring to. So
Yeah, it's always out there. We're our own worst critics as developers because we care so much. I think that's the thing.
Well, when anybody asks me, I last year I was traveling to a lot of hackathons, and I was both participating or judging or helping facilitate. And there's a lot of students at these hackathons. There are a number of different universities, and they'd say, "What's the best way for me to get into programming for realsies?" And I would always say the same thing. Like, you should be contributing to open source projects, and you should be improving your GitHub profile. Because if you come to me for a job, before I look at your resume, before I look at your Twitter profile, before I look at anything else on social media, I'm going to read your code. And it doesn't need to be amazing. It just needs to look like something that I could have written at some point in my career. It needs to look like something that I can actually understand, and something that works and runs.
You bring up a good point, though. A lot of places do that, where they use GitHub as a resume, right? So for me, I work in a place where we have a whole bunch of private GitHub repositories. So none of that shows to the public. So I have like all green on my screen when I'm logged in. And then I have like, one little speck here, one speck there when I log out. So, I mean, is that something that people take into consideration when they're looking through that?
I mean, in my opinion, so I came from an enterprise originally and had no public or open source software. And then my largest open source project got, shot like poor Yeller in the backyard. So, I think so in some senses, but I mean, I think you guys can probably speak to this. You don't need to read a large quantity of somebody's source to understand where they are in their in their developer life cycle. Like, you kind of can look at something they've written and say, oh, they understand all of these things, and you can make those assumptions. You don't have to read a lot of code to make that leap.
Yeah, and it doesn't have to be proper open source for purposes of a resume either. Like, as long as it's public source,
right.
As long as it's something that you can, like, I don't know, go to a web page and view source and be like, hey, this is the thing I built for this company's web page. Like, that's legit too. It's nicer if it's all the whole repo, and you can go through history and look at a technique and how you refactored things. But it doesn't have to be like an open source license. I mean, we kind of think of any source you can view as open, but it's kind of a big difference there. Being able to reuse as you see fit is not the same as being able to pin it up on the wall and show your mom.
Yeah, I think they're really telling you two different things. I think somebody's contributions are telling you the type of projects they care about and want to participate in. And their source, the source that they have in GitHub or on their website that you can look at, is telling you what kind of developer they are, not now, but when they actually wrote that source.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the worst things you can do, though, is only have an example of something you wrote several years ago, because that's almost worse than no example at all.
Yeah, you're totally doing yourself a disservice. I always encourage them to care more about their GitHub profile and maintaining it than they care and maintain their LinkedIn profile.
Yeah, and I think for young developers or young in their career, it's important that we also point out that kind of towards I think Nick, you were saying this, is that it doesn't have to be something that's important in the sense of you're going to get 100 stars and everyone's going to love it. Just do something you think's interesting. For example, one thing I've been playing with is I've been curious about what does it take to compile a language down to the JVM and down to JavaScript. Now, is it going to be useful? Is anybody going to use my language? No. But it's just something I was curious about. Now I put it on GitHub. And so whatever it is you're playing with, unless it's owned by your company or something, just put it on GitHub. Let people see it.
So that's another thing, too. I think a lot of people confuse Git and GitHub with not just each other, but with open source, where that's the only place you can go to do this. And I think there's different communities that, maybe you're driven through SVN or even, other areas to store your code online. What tools and places on the internet do you guys go to find out about open source?
Mostly GitHub.
Right. It seems to be the central for web development today, the central area.
Right. And I'll say, I'm heavy in Scala right now. We have have some resources for finding projects, but it's specific to that, and ultimately they all live on GitHub. For me, if I'm looking for something, I just Google JVM blank, whatever it is I'm looking for. Google always sends me to GitHub, though.
I recently started doing some iOS work, and I ran into issues where I'm looking for open source stuff for that, and I had a lot of trouble finding stuff for it, where I was used to looking for web technologies and different projects, and I found a lot. And for the iOS, I didn't find as much, with pods and things like that. Have you guys had experience with other different technologies?
Yeah, I mean, one thing with JavaScript is that it's easy to sell having your source public to your boss, because anyone can just view source of your site, and your source is public right there anyway.
Yeah.
So the arguments there are more around license than about whether or not you can show the technique to do a thing, because everyone can find it anyway.
And have you guys had experience with the different types of licenses that are out there? Have you read them?
I mean, these days I stick with the ISC license. It's basically a revision of the MIT license with a little bit removed. That's not really necessary anymore.
Right.
It's basically the same as MIT or BSD2 clause. It's as simple as it gets. It's basically do with this as you want, but you can't claim it as your own. You have to say that I wrote it, and you can't sue me for it.
A lot of the Apache stuff is GPL. Have you guys seen many differences between that and the MIT?
I mean, in the JavaScript world, GPL is basically viewed as poison. As soon as you include a GPL library in your code, in most cases you have to GPL everything else that you're working on involved with it. It's a dangerous game to play, and you pretty much need a lawyer if you're going to use a GPL code with code that you don't want to GPL yourself.
Yeah, it's the same with the JVM world.
Wow, I didn't even realize that. Good to know. Taking notes.
Yeah, the Mozilla public license and the Apache 2 license are both liberal licenses like the MIT license, but they're much more complete. They have stuff around patents and a bunch of details that MIT kind of leaves unspecified. So
Right.
that's I think that's a good place for corporate open source to be headed, is like Apache 2 and MPL.
Okay. Have you guys used, I mean, most of you guys have been working strictly with Git, I'm assuming, right? Yeah, for the most part?
I've used some alternatives in the past, but nothing I ever enjoyed using as much as I enjoy using Git.
Yeah, plus one to the enjoyment part. So right now, my employer, we're actually using SVN, and I joke with them all the time, because I'm like, if open source is using Git, it's probably the most favorable tool for the developers, because if you're doing open source, you're not going to use tooling you hate.
Right. Well, a lot of Java applications and open source stuff that I've seen too is on SVN. And if you go to code.google too, a lot of that stuff is hosted on SVN. Like, I think Go, the main Go is SVN, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe I'm wrong. But there is a port on GitHub.
Mercurial?
Is it Mercurial?
I think so.
I'd
Where
guess.
would you go to find Mercurial?
But I think they're moving it to Git. That was a recent announcement.
Oh, nice.
As for the Java stuff, I would assume that's going to be for historical reasons.
Yeah. And, there's migration strategies for that. I've been on projects where we've used Git with the same workflow as SVN, which doesn't provide any advantages, of course, but it's doable. But it's harder to go to the other way.
Yeah.
I think, have you guys heard of Gitter? I think that's what it's called. It's a chat tool that is built around your GitHub project. And I've recently been doing a lot of things using React, and there's a Facebook introduced this unidirectional flow architecture for applications.
Flux.
Called Flux, yeah. And there's a framework called Fluxer. And I've recently been, kind of digging into the Fluxer community, looking to see whether or not it's something I want to participate in. And they're using Gitter a lot. And man, I find that is just an unbelievable tool. I've never seen it used before, but I expect to see that popping up a lot. It is this tool that you can use to communicate with the people that are both curious and participating and contributing to the project.
Can you put that in the show notes on the
Sure.
doc? That'd be great. I started using Slack with Git and Jira, and that's been really cool with the notifications. So if you're on a team and you wanna get a lot, they have a lot of plugins, so it's pretty easy. I've been trying to find tools that integrate the entire workflow that we have, and it shows every time somebody commits something, you can set it up to show you in the chat. It'll show the commit message and everything. So it's one place. You don't have to switch context, which is nice.
Speaking of open source and Slack, I'm actually surprised there hasn't been a HipChat/Slack competitor that was open source that you could self-host and that had all of the conveniences that they introduce.
That's our next project, right?
Pardon?
That's our next project, right, Matt?
Yeah, well, I mean, Slack's kind of like taken the community by storm, really. I mean, it's made so much noise and it's had so much success so quickly, but it's not an open source project, so I find that surprising.
Yeah, I can totally relate to that because it's been a pretty cool tool. I've been trying to find a lot of integration tools for pairing with that too, and every pairing tool that I've tried has some merits, and most of them have some horrible things as well.
Speaking of tools, have any of you experienced playing around with Git Flow?
Yeah, we're using it on a project right now, actually.
You like it?
It's nice. We're using the tool for it and command line.
Mm-hmm.
So that makes it a little easier. But once you understand the diagram of how this works, and just so for people who don't know what Git Flow is just a way to work with Git that enables, in some cases, for us to have this develop branch and a master branch. And every time you develop, you work on a branch off of develop, usually. And then you'll just merge your feature or your card, whatever. If you're in Jira, usually there's a ticket would be one feature. And so you'll merge that back when you're done. And then you have release branches, and you have, there's a naming convention for these. There's so it's very stricter than normal Git. So it's a little easier to trace back to certain things because everything has its own branch and gets merged or rebased in. Did I miss anything on that?
Well, one of the main advantages is the first time you've got a feature branch that you then do a bug fix in, and then you need to do an emergency fix, getting that bug fix out, and you can't release the feature at the same time. You're just all kinds of tangled up, and you'll really wish that you had some more structure and more discipline around your Git process.
Yeah, that's the hotfix branches, and then there's like a temporary intermediate branch, right? Am I thinking of something different?
I think that's right. I don't actually follow a strict Git flow. I just try to not get myself too tangled up.
Yeah, it's a nice model, but like I said, I've been on projects where we've used Git as SVN, which is not really advantageous, right?
You try not to get yourself too tied up.
But Yay!
I think it does kind of, to tie this back into open source, though, I think it does kind of, let me just say I endorse Git Flow. You should totally use it. And if you Google, maybe we'll include this in the show notes, but if you look up a successful Git branching model, I think that was the first place I ever found it. It's got a lot of great documentation. And since then, there's like tools that have popped up that help you manage a repository using Git Flow much easier, which are great too, and I've used those in the past. But I think it's kind of this and part of why I love software engineering so much is we've created this culture of sharing everything, literally everything about what we do, except for what differentiates our products, except for the thing that we sell.
Yes, the core business logic, right? Core business stuff.
That's an amazing place to be because then we just all move so much faster together.
Yeah, and I have to brag on Netflix. I dropped off the call, so sorry if I'm a little out of context here, but Netflix has done an awesome job of open sourcing like everything they do, right? Because Netflix's value is their content. Well, they're not going to give you that, but everything they do to deliver that content is open source. I see them at conferences and things all the time, always learning things about how to make better use of AWS cloud infrastructure or whatever it may be that they're taking advantage of, and it's really interesting.
Yeah, netflix.github.io is like an unbelievable resource. I always look into that, especially if I'm thinking about something like continuous integration, which is another great tool in an open source project if you don't want to have to manually run through everybody's every pull request tests. But I think one of the coolest examples and one of the coolest things that Netflix does is they take this concept of open source and they also make it about sending people to conferences, as Joe mentioned, sending people to conferences and letting them discuss their open source projects. So we're going kind of like one step beyond documenting and sharing our code. We're getting to the point where we're actually helping other people understand and use it in person at these conferences, which is amazing that these companies are willing to pay us to go to these conferences, and thank God they are.
Well, they get a gain from it too, right? They get their name out there that, hey, Netflix is doing these great things, developer community, come work for us.
That's right. I don't even work for them. Here I am bragging on them.
Yeah, totally. Drinking the Kool-Aid.
Yeah, and also I think it's just the open source spirit of things could always get better, and we love seeing things get better. I think that's what keeps us motivated to work on these things. And I know for me, that's kind of what driven me to keep stuff open source. It's like, well, it started there. I can't, ethically in my mind, make it closed source all of a sudden and make it better and not share that back. But, it can be better. I put it out there. Other people can check it out, take advantage of that. They can make it better. And just kind of wrapping back around, as we talked about earlier, in the fear and everything, it's there is fear that we'll make mistakes, but if you always believe things can be better, it's not as good as it can be, and that's okay.
It's definitely true. And if you're working with designers or even product managers, I know Thoughtbot has a day every week. They have a day where everyone in the entire company works towards open source. So how have you seen contributions from people who aren't developers?
Crickets.
Yes. Has anyone seen any of that?
I've worked actually with a lot of. I strongly value design input during an open source project. I think most of the projects that I've had any success with have included a designer.
Yeah, that's right. You had Nick Tassone, right?
And I'm not sure if you are aware of this, but I brought Nick with me to Heroku.
Oh, that's awesome.
He came on his own merit, but I strongly encourage him to take a position there, and I strongly encourage them to hire him because I think a designer's input on any project is just invaluable.
Yeah, there's a lot of details and considerations about functionality that user experience people are much more adept at doing in general.
Absolutely. Our project at work has we've had the pleasure of having a designer come on board here lately, and some of the engineers kind of feel like, hey, our UI was good enough, what's your problem? But everybody, and hopefully if they look deep down in themselves, they see it's much better because they just think about the things that the engineers don't think of. And their contribution is invaluable. And I wasn't going to immediately speak up on this question. I hope there was be more interesting input. But the designer I'm working with right now, he and I are talking about possibly doing just a blog post on how using our open source stack with Lift and Angular and how it complemented his work, because it's meant to be, the way we took it was view first, let the designer have his sandbox and do his work and do it however he like, and we have the minimum impact on integrating that into our application. So that's where we're going to have some input back into the open source community, is just kind of share some practices and things that worked well with the particular stack we used.
There was a project I heard about a while back called Open-Karma, so open-karma.com. And this was Saltine Justine on Twitter. She's a designer, and she found this Ruby developer when she was at a conference speaking, and they haven't launched this project. I'm surprised, but it was a way to get designers specifically involved with the open source community to provide value with their skill set into the projects, because that's something that a lot of the projects don't have, is good UI and good more importantly, good user experience flow, right? So it's a good one to take a look at once it's released, hopefully soon. But it's an interesting concept.
That the hardest thing for me with my projects is that most of the complicated stuff is really back-end server logic, and there's some need for UI, but we put it off because it's so hard as a developer to do this well, and having a designer would make all the difference in the world to making these more usable.
Yeah, I would say in our case it's deceptively more difficult on the back end, and I think it's because we understand those details, and you go on the front end, it should be simple, right? And but designers are the ones that's going to make that actually come to fruition.
I think it's easy as a developer to wire stuff up and make the buttons call the functions that they need to, but to really make that something that's understandable and easily usable for a user is a completely different kind of thinking that doesn't come naturally when you are buried in Vim all day.
That's right.
Well, I think we also make a mistake as developers in some cases that, we've all been guilty of saying, okay, well, we need to design for this thing. I will go and give a designer $500 and I expect a design. But that is just, they design in the same way that we develop. They create something that isn't perfect, and then they slowly chip away at it until it meets their goals, or it meets their objectives. You look at some of the open source projects that haven't had the uptake that they maybe expected. I'd point at most of the Linux distros, especially the ones that are on mobile devices. They're just not beautiful. Maybe with the exception of Firefox OS, which is a very recent addition, they've just failed to get any real market share. And I think that's not because of the guys that are hacking away on the back end. That's because of the way they look and the way that they function and the way that you interact with them, and the fact that those aren't polished experiences that someone's poured energy or money.
We're losing you a little bit there, Matt. Can you repeat just what you just said? You're on mute.
Thank you. I think a big part of why the Linux distros don't get more uptake in the kind of general PC user category, it's mostly developers, is simply because their interfaces aren't polished enough to attract people. They're not beautiful and easy enough to use.
Yeah. Another note too, I know there's some of you guys have done a lot of streaks out there where you've had X amount of days contributing to open source. And I know, Rob, I listened to your podcast, the WaterCooler, and you spoke on there about a 365-day GitHub streak that you're working on.
Yes. Right now, today was day one. Day 101. So,
wow.
I'm hoping to. Kyle Simpson and I were talking about it, and with his You Don't Know JavaScript series of books, he was able to work and commit and contribute not only to that but to other plugins that he has. 365 days, and it really looks nice because you see all these green dots all the way across, and so it's interesting because it keeps you to where you're devoted and towards open source and making a valid effort towards working with Git. So I decided at that point that I was going to do the same, and whether it be on projects that I'm working on or other projects, is to make it a valid attempt to be part of the open source community.
There is a little bit of a caveat with that, right? Don't you have to commit to a master branch for it to count?
Yeah, sometimes that's difficult.
Yeah, that's what gets me is I'll do all kinds of commits on a branch, and then it doesn't count.
It count retroactively though once it gets merged.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
I was gonna say, can't you just cheat and do a merge commit on top? Has anyone else done anything similar?
I think my best streak is like 9 days, so I've got nothing on that.
Yeah, I think I had 13 total, maybe, and not open source. So probably open source would be 3. All right. Is there anything that we haven't discussed? We're running out of time here, so anybody have anything that they'd want to talk about with open source?
I guess I just wanted to mention that that open source does have a bit of a dark side, and I think a lot of people they come into these open source communities expecting it to be kind of very very friendly and fluffy up front, but a lot of people get fatigued, year after year pounding away on the same project. They get into it because they care about it and they're interested in that initial creative process, and then suddenly you have all these people with expectations.
Yeah, it's true. It's very true.
So if you're going to get into a project, like, know what you're getting yourself into.
Yeah,
it's hard too, because if you abandon your project, then everyone gives you flack for leaving your users high and dry.
I know, and then you got to find someone who's willing to take it on, and the people are all upset, and they'll tell you about it, but then they're I can't do it. I haven't had that happen to me myself, but I've seen it happen to other developers.
I think the worst story that I've heard about open source is that developer at Goldman Sachs who ended up going to jail because he brought some GPL code in, and then he tried to contribute back what he wrote while he was at Goldman, took some of it with him, and they went after him for it and put him in jail. That's a pretty ugly story.
Yeah,
that's
horrible.
That'll make you think about that.
We need some work on those laws.
That's right, everybody. Licenses do matter.
Yes.
Yeah, look them up.
The worst part, I think, is that Goldman was actually violating the GPL. So.
Yeah.
And also, when you say the dark side, the first thing that comes to my mind is that communities can be pretty gruesome at times, unfortunately. Like you say, you expect everyone to be welcoming and everything, I think Matt said, and it's not always that way. And right now in the Scala community, there's some meltdowns going in to some of the communities, and I'm not going to get into that because I'm not part of those communities, but it can be really unfortunate at times, and it's it's obviously the technology is not at fault. It's just people are people produce problems, and we're not always what you would expect out of other human beings. So there can be, you can come in really thinking it's going to be this great experience, and it can really turn on you.
Keep your head up.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the key is just not to be too emotionally invested in the code you write.
Yeah, that is a good point, Matt.
That's kind of easier said than done.
Absolutely. I mean, and I think you need to be emotionally invested in the project. But if you're emotionally invested in all of the code that you write, then it won't just make you it won't just create the possibility that you'll be one of those people that melt down publicly when people criticize you. It'll also mean that you get too attached to the solutions that you think are appropriate in the moment, and you'll be less likely to look back and reflect and find a more optimal path to that solution.
Yeah. So
I find myself doing that all the time. I get very attached to my solutions, and I'm like, no, this is the right way to do this. And then it really takes somebody coming in and like unsticking me, like, no, this is wrong. You should have done it like this. And then I'll give it up. I'll let go.
That's why I like pair programming the most, I think, is that I have a hard time saying, okay, I'm going to try a different way. Once I'm invested to a certain point, you're like, no, this is going to work. I just have one more thing to do, and it'll work. And then 5 hours later, you're like, I should have just stopped. But if you were pairing at that point, the other person would have said, dude, what are you thinking? Let's try this approach. So you have an extra person, working with you, and that's a good way to maybe start looking at some of the contributions. Like maybe you pair with somebody to do that.
You can get that same kind of effect out of code reviews. It lags a little bit behind.
Yeah.
But the important thing is to make sure your code review process isn't just a green light. You don't just have people giving a thumbs up every time. You have to make sure they give it a critical review, and that's
an honest review.
Yeah, and that's kind of hard because you don't want to offend people and you want to keep the project moving quick. So sometimes you're just like, all right, just move it on and then I can fix it later or something like that. But you gotta, that's doing a disservice to yourself and the person you're reviewing.
I think that's a perfect way to say it too. A disservice to that person.
I think that's like the biggest benefit of continuous integration, honestly, is that you take away the things that are most easy to criticize. So, for example, code quality or following code guidelines. It's really easy to say to somebody, hey, you should have dropped that parentheses down to the next line. But if that's all caught by your continuous integration system, then what do they have left but to look at how your code actually works and give you feedback on that?
Yeah.
And that's really what you want feedback on. I find too often with code reviews it becomes like you want to catch a couple of simple things and then you're moving on. It's like a token effort, but that's not really what you want in a code review. So I totally agree with that.
So we're out of time now. Do you guys you want to say any last things about how people can reach you or find you to get more information? What are your Twitter handles or wherever social network you're at, your GitHub handles? Let's start with Rob this time.
Sure. My Twitter account is @pertray1, PERTRAI1, and my blog is at robesimpson.me.
Okay, and Nick?
You can find me on the internet at nrn.io, and I'm nrn on GitHub.
Nice. Matt?
You can find me on Twitter at Matt_Krieger. I would like to plug, if I could, flu shots. Strongly recommend you get a flu shot. I didn't, and I'm suffering for it. And Heroku just released and announced a brand new developer experience with a new dashboard and metrics. These are things that you should check out over the holidays. So,
is there a flu shot button on there?
Instantly administer it. It's an open source flu shot. Anyone can contribute their own.
Has an API, contacts a doctor, and they run to your place.
I wish. That's why I didn't get a flu shot, because I had none of those conveniences.
Damn. All right, Joe?
Yeah, I'll just give you my Twitters and my GitHub handles, which is Joesky, Joescii. Joe would ask you in of it's the best I come up with a really common name.
And Christian?
I'm Christian Smith on GitHub and Anvil Hacks on Twitter. And
yeah, on GitHub you can see him playing an acoustic guitar, so that's the Christian Smith you're looking for. So thank you guys all for coming. I really appreciate it. It's been very educational for me, and I hope our listeners get some really good information to take away. We are going to have in January some open source projects coming on the show where we have Service Worker, and I guess some people from Google and some people from Mozilla are going to be on, and we're going to have some people from the ReactiveX community, Microsoft, coming on and talking about that. So some good open source stuff coming up, and hopefully Matt will get you on with some Heroku stuff soon. So
would love to join you again. Yeah, and you know what? If you're going to take anything away from this, let it be that you should have an appropriately licensed open source project. I'm gonna go back and double check all of my licenses now.
Yes, we all should. All right. Well, thanks a lot, guys, and we are out of here.
Thanks, folks. It's been fun.
This episode comes to you at least in
Thank
part
you.
through the support
Yeah, thanks for
and
having
sound
us.
equipment generously supplied by 3 Pillar Global. 3 Pillar is a software product development company in Fairfax, Virginia, and 3 Pillar is a leader in creating purposeful and innovative product experiences. 3 Pillar was recently named to the Washington Post Top Workplaces list for 2014. So if you want to follow 3 Pillar on the Twitters, it's @3PillarGlobal. And to find out more and see current job openings, please visit 3pillarglobal.com. That's 3, the number, pillarglobal.com. Thank you. No, thank you.